Little Women by Louisa May Alcott.
Little Women, Chapter 1, Playing Pilgrims. The March household, though modest in its appearance, carried within it a warmth that the winter frost could never extinguish. It was Christmas Eve, and snow lay heaped upon the roofs and window sills, clinging to the bare branches outside. Through the frosty panes of the sitting-room, a soft lamplight glowed, falling upon 4 young faces gathered round the hearth. The fire crackled and spat, though its blaze was not so large as in grander homes, and the stockings that hung nearby were modest, each carefully mended and worn from years of use. It was here, in this simple yet loving circle, that the March sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, sat together, each busy with her own small task, yet bound by the closeness that only sisters know. "Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," Jo declared, suddenly, throwing herself upon the rug with such energy that the cat darted out of her way. Her long legs stretched awkwardly, and her brown hair, which could never be persuaded to stay smooth, tumbled over her shoulders. Jo was 16, tall for her age, and full of restless spirit, which often startled her quieter sisters. Meg, the eldest at 17, looked up from the pair of gloves she was mending. Her gentle face, framed by smooth brown hair, wore an expression of patience tinged with wistfulness. "It's dreadful to be poor," she sighed, "especially at Christmas." Her voice held no bitterness, only the weary acceptance of one who had already felt the burden of responsibility more than a girl her age ought to. Beth, the third sister, small and fair, sat contentedly upon a low stool, her nimble fingers busy with patching worn sleeve. She lifted her eyes shyly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the peace of the room. "We've got father and mother and each other," she said softly, in her quiet, comforting way. Her words fell like a gentle balm upon her sister's complaints. Amy, the youngest, 12 years old, perched gracefully upon a chair, her fair curls catching the firelight. She gave a little sniff, her small nose tilting upward. "That's poor comfort. I don't think it's fair that some girls have plenty of pretty things, while we must go without. Just look at my shoes, worn through at the toe, and my dress. It's disgraceful." She smoothed her skirt with an air of offended dignity. Jo laughed, tossing a pillow in Amy's direction. "You don't need fine clothes to look like a doll, Miss Vanity. You'll be admired wherever you go, rags and all." Amy pouted. "I should like to be admired properly. I don't mean to be vain, but I do wish we had the means to live as others do." Meg sighed again, glancing toward the fire. "We can't do much. We must make the best of it." For a moment the sisters were silent, each girl thinking her own thoughts. The ticking of the old clock filled the pause, mingling with the snapping of the flames. The house was quiet, though faintly one could hear the distant sound of carolers braving the snowy streets. At last, Jo sat upright, her face alight with sudden inspiration. "I know. We each have $1, don't we? Marmee gave them to us, saying we might spend them as we like. What if we buy something splendid for ourselves? I'm tired of working hard and having nothing to show for it." Amy clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, yes, let's.
I should dearly like a set of drawing pencils." Meg's brow furrowed, torn between desire and duty. "I'd love a pretty pair of gloves, something fit to wear to parties, if ever we are invited." Beth hesitated, her eyes downcast. Perhaps some new sheet music. But even as they dreamed aloud, each girl's conscience stirred. Jo's expression grew thoughtful, and she lay back against the hearthrug. "But wouldn't it be nicer, instead of spending the money on ourselves, if we bought something for Marmee? She's always working, always helping others, and never spends a penny on herself." Beth's face brightened instantly, her whole being glowing with approval. "Oh, yes, let's do that, something to make her happy." Meg smiled, her desire for gloves already fading in the warmth of the idea. She'll be surprised and pleased. Amy, though reluctant, at last agreed, though she added with a sigh, "Well, I suppose pencils can wait, but I shall get her something very fine." The four sisters, united in this plan, began to discuss, with animated eagerness, what gifts they might buy. A pair of slippers, a handkerchief, some cologne, a book. Each item was weighed with careful thought and measured against their meager sums. The room, which only a short while ago had been filled with sighs and complaints, now buzzed with laughter and excited voices. Later, as the fire burned low, Meg took up a worn little book from the table. Its cover was faded, but her touch upon it was reverent. "You know what Marmee said this morning, that we should think of this as our pilgrimage, like Christian in the Pilgrim's Progress. We've got burdens to bear and a road to travel before we reach the celestial city." Jo groaned good-naturedly. "I'm not fond of being a pilgrim, but I suppose if we make a game of it, we might get through our troubles better." Beth's soft voice chimed in, "I like it. We can help one another along the way, just as the book says." Amy smoothed her dress with importance. "Then I shall be a pilgrim who looks elegant, even with a burden." The sisters laughed, their spirits lifted once more, and soon the sound of their merriment filled the little sitting room. Outside, the snow continued to fall in a hush, covering the world in white, while inside, four young hearts dreamed of journeys ahead, some known, many unknown, yet each bound together by love. And so began their pilgrimage.
Chapter 2. A Merry Christmas. Morning came bright and clear, the world outside lying under a coverlet of white so pure that even the air seemed touched with holiness. The first rays of sunlight glistened upon the snow, setting the frosted branches ablaze with diamonds. From within the March home arose the sense of breakfast, humble though it was, and the sounds of four young voices stirred with anticipation. It was Christmas morning. The March sisters, who had gone to bed with hearts full of plans for their mother's gifts, now awoke with eagerness. Each had prepared a small surprise, purchased with her own dollar, and chosen with loving thought. Jo was the first downstairs, her long limbs clattering against the steps as she hurried. She carried a pair of slippers wrapped in newspaper but tied with a sprig of evergreen for cheer. Meg soon followed, her gift a neat pair of gloves sewn with her own fine stitches where coin would not stretch far enough. Beth, her cheeks pink from excitement, bore a handkerchief embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots in blue. And Amy, proud, though still half asleep, descended with a little vial of cologne tucked carefully in her hands.
They laid their gifts upon the table near the hearth, arranging them so that when Marmee came down, her eyes would fall upon the sight at once. The fire had been kindled, and the room glowed with a warmth that seemed to echo their own secret happiness. Suddenly, the door opened, and in came Marmee, Mrs. March, her tall figure wrapped in a simple shawl, her face gentle but lined with cares that kindness alone could not erase. At the sight before her, she paused, surprised, then looked from one daughter to another. "My dear girls, what is all this?" "It's for you, Marmee," cried Jo, unable to keep the secret longer. "See, slippers for your tired feet. Meg made you gloves, Beth stitched this handkerchief, and Amy brought you cologne. We couldn't let Christmas come without giving you something." For a moment, Mrs. March's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She gathered them into her arms, embracing each in turn. "My precious children, you give me far more than gifts. You give me your love. That is treasure enough to make the poorest Christmas rich." The girls glowed with delight, their hearts swelling with that deep, quiet joy which follows an unselfish deed. Breakfast was soon laid out, a simple meal of bread and milk with a modest dish of sausage and hot buckwheat cakes, a feast to the March family who had long learned to be content with little. The girls were about to seat themselves when their mother, who had been reading a note delivered by a boy at the door, looked up gravely. "Children," she said softly, "there is a family not far from here, a poor woman with 6 little ones. They are in one room with no fire, little food, and the baby is very sick. Will you give them your breakfast as a Christmas gift?" For a moment, the sisters hesitated. Sausage and hot cakes are tempting to young appetites, but the hesitation was brief. Beth was the first to rise, gathering her plate with eager hands. "Yes, let's take it all," she said. Jo sprang up, throwing her napkin aside. "I'll carry the sausage." Meg wrapped the bread, and Amy, though making a small face at parting with the cakes she loved, bundled them carefully in a clean cloth. Soon the whole meal was packed into baskets, and the sisters, led by their mother, went out into the crisp winter air. The sight that met them in the poor cottage humbled even their generous hearts. The room was bare and cold, the wind crept through broken panes stuffed with rags. A thin woman, pale and weary, sat huddled by a straw bed where lay a sickly infant, while 5 other children crouched about shivering and hungry-eyed. Without a word, Mrs. March set down her bundle and began tending to the fire. Meg and Jo spread the food upon the table. Beth warmed the children's hands in hers, and Amy, forgetting her own vanity, fed the youngest crumbs with tender care. "Oh, bless you, good angels!" the poor mother sobbed, tears falling freely as she watched her children eat with joy. The Marches left that place with cheeks tingling from cold, but hearts glowing with warmth no feast at home could have given them. As they returned, Jo whispered, "That was the best Christmas breakfast we ever had," and the others agreed. Back home, a second surprise awaited them, for when they entered their parlor, they found a table spread with delights far beyond their own means. Turkeys and pies, cakes and fruits, and many another dainty. A note lay on the table, signed in the fine hand of old Mr. Lawrence, the wealthy neighbor whose large house stood next door. "He must have known," Meg said softly, her eyes bright. "He's a dear man," Jo declared. "I'll thank him for this before the day is out." Thus, what began as a day of self-denial became one of richest blessing. The sisters learned that in giving they had received far more. Evening came, and with it music and laughter. Jo produced a small play she had written, and the sisters, dressing themselves in odds and ends, performed it upon their homemade stage, with Meg as the heroine, Jo as the villain, Amy in grand airs as the lady of fashion, and Beth presiding at the piano, her sweet voice joining in the merriment. Their audience was small, only Marmee, Hannah the servant, and a curious head peering through the curtain, belonging, of course, to young Laurie, who had slipped in unseen. Yet the applause was genuine, and the girls went to bed that night tired but happier than they had ever been. Christmas had come not with rich presents or golden splendor, but with love, laughter, and the joy of giving.
Chapter 3. The Lawrence Boy. The glow of Christmas lingered in the March household long after the day itself had passed. The sisters were still speaking of their play, their laughter, and the unexpected kindness of Mr. Lawrence, when the topic of their neighbor returned again and again, like a tune that could not be forgotten. The great stone mansion next door loomed over their modest house like a giant beside a sparrow's nest. To the girls it seemed a place of wealth and mystery. Its windows shone brightly at night, revealing glimpses of stately rooms, glittering chandeliers, and the shadowy figure of an old man, severe of face, but noble in bearing. Yet what drew their attention most was not the grandfather, but the boy, Theodore Lawrence, known to his friends as Laurie, who lived there under his care. They had caught sight of him before, a dark-eyed youth leaning idly at the window, or striding quickly across the snowy garden, his figure both proud and restless. To Jo especially, he seemed a character worth knowing. It was on a frosty afternoon, not long after Christmas, that Jo's chance came. Meg had been invited to a small gathering at the gardener's, and Jo accompanied her, though unwillingly. The gardener's parlor, filled with fashionable young ladies in bright gowns, made Jo ill at ease. Her dress, though neatly mended, seemed plain beside the silks and satins of the others. She retreated to a quiet corner, wishing herself anywhere else. It was then she noticed the boy, Laurie, seated alone near the window, his expression one of mingled boredom and shyness. He was dressed well, but without ostentation, and his dark eyes scanned the room as if he longed for escape. Their gazes met, and Jo, always bold, offered him a small nod. To her delight, he smiled, an expression at once boyish and friendly. Summoning her courage, Jo crossed the room and sat near him. "How do you do?" she began frankly, her tone brisk as though they had long been acquaintances. Laurie seemed startled, then amused. "I am quite well, thank you. And you?" "Rather uncomfortable," Jo confessed. "These fine parties are not in my line. I came with my sister Meg, but she is busy talking, so I'm stranded." Laurie laughed, a soft sound as though laughter were new to him. "I don't care for them either. My grandfather insists I come, but I'd rather be at home with a book or my piano." Jo's eyes brightened. "Do you play?" "A little," he said modestly. "That's splendid. Beth, my sister, loves music. She would adore hearing you. You must come and see us sometime. We're not grand, but we make up in fun what we lack in splendor." Laurie looked at her curiously, as though surprised by her easy manner. Then his face softened. "I should like that very much." I haven't many friends." "Neither have I," Joe admitted. "But I mean to be yours if you don't mind." "I don't mind at all," Laurie said warmly. "In fact, I should be very glad." Their conversation, once begun, flowed freely, ranging from books to music to the tediumness of parties and the delights of snowball fights. Jo, with her lively tongue, soon had Laurie laughing heartily, and when Meg came to fetch her, she was surprised to find her anxious sister deep in friendly talk with the rich young neighbor. On the way home, Meg teased gently. "Why, Jo, you seemed quite taken with young Mr. Lawrence." "Nonsense," Jo retorted, though her eyes sparkled. "He's only a boy, like me, and dreadfully lonely in that great house. I mean to be kind to him, that's all." A few days later, an opportunity came to prove her words. Laurie fell ill with a heavy cold, confined his room in the great Lawrence mansion. From her window she could see the curtains drawn, and her imagination conjured images of him lying alone in grandeur with no motherly hand to smooth his pillow. Without hesitation, she wrote a short, bold note and sent it by Hannah. "Dear Laurie, we are sorry to hear you are ill. If you would like company, we should be glad to come and see you. We can bring books, music, or whatever might cheer you. Your neighbors and friends, the Marches." Not long after, a polite reply arrived, written in a neat but eager hand. "Dear Miss Jo, thank you for your kind offer. I should like it above all things. Will you come tomorrow afternoon? Yours sincerely, Theodore Lawrence." So it was that the March sisters, carrying baskets of fruit and flowers, made their first visit to the great house. The hall was vast, the ceilings high, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors looked down upon them as they followed a servant to Laurie's room. There they found him propped up among pillows, pale but smiling, his eyes lighting as though their presence had banished half his illness at once. Beth, shy as ever, placed her flowers upon the table. Meg inquired gently after his health. Amy, with all the airs of a little lady, spoke prettily. But it was Jo who, dragging a chair to his bedside, began to chatter in her frank way, telling stories of their Christmas play, of Beth's kittens, of Amy's artistic ambitions, until Laurie laughed until he coughed. From that day forward, the ice between the houses was broken. Laurie became their friend, not as the Lawrence boy of the grand mansion, but as a companion, a brother almost, who shared in their games, their confidences, and their hearts. And Jo, though she would not confess it, felt a secret pride in having opened the first door into his lonely life.
Chapter 4, Burdens. The new friendship with Laurie brought sunshine into the March household, yet daily cares still pressed upon the sisters, reminding each that youth, though merry, is not free from burdens. The March family had long been acquainted with sacrifice. Their father's absence, their mother's constant labors, and their own limited means gave each daughter a weight to carry. And in the quiet days after Christmas, these burdens began to show. Meg, the eldest, bore hers most keenly. At 17, she was still considered beautiful, with soft brown eyes and gentle manners, but she felt the sting of poverty more than the rest.
She worked as a governess for the King family, spending long hours tending spoiled children who treated her with little respect. Their fine clothes and rich surroundings only deepened her discontent with her own plain wardrobe and modest life. "How I hate being poor," she confided to Joe one evening as she folded her one good dress with careful hands. "It isn't fair that we must work while others only play. I do my best, but sometimes I envy the girls with fine gowns and no duties." Joe, sprawled across the bed with a pencil in hand, replied briskly, "Better to have brains than gowns, Meg. I'd not trade places with a silly beauty for all the satin in the world." Yet, inwardly, she too felt the rub of circumstance. For Jo's burden was her fiery temper and restless spirit, which made her duties doubly hard. She worked for her great-aunt March, a wealthy, sharp-tongued old lady who required endless errands, reading aloud for hours, and tolerating her whims. She bore it with courage, partly because the work allowed her time to write, and partly because she hoped Aunt March might one day leave her something in her will. Still, her quick tongue often got the better of her. One morning, returning home after a scolding, Jo thrust herself into a chair and declared, "I'd rather be a man and go to war than spend my life fussing over Aunt March's dog and fan." Beth, who was setting the table, looked up with a smile that was more sympathy than rebuke. Her burden was of another kind, a timid nature that shrank from the world. At 13, she was delicate in health and spirit, happiest at home with her piano or her kittens. The thought of venturing among strangers terrified her, yet she carried her load with gentleness, smoothing quarrels, comforting weariness, and filling the house with quiet cheer. "Never mind, Jo," she said softly. "At least Aunt March lets you read her books, and you do love books." Jo's frown softened. "That's true, Beth, and you're right, it isn't all bad. But I do wish I could gallop away like a knight and have adventures instead of staying cooped up like a hen." Amy's burden, though youngest, was no lighter. At 12, she longed for elegance and refinement, yet her lot was a desk at school, where she was often ridiculed for her airs. Worse still, she was sometimes punished for her vanity. One day she came home with flushed cheeks, carrying her slate under her arm. "It's a shame and disgrace," she cried, her lip trembling. "Mr. Davis struck me on the hand with his ruler just because I brought pickled limes to school. The girls trade them, and I wanted to be like the rest. But he said it was vanity and extravagance." Jo's eyes flashed. "I'd have given him a piece of my mind. He had no right." Meg only sighed. "Well, Amy, perhaps you should not have taken so many. We cannot afford such treats." Amy pouted, her pride wounded more than her hand. "I don't care. I won't go back there. I'll never forgive him." Beth stroked her hair gently, whispering, "Never mind, dear. You can study at home with me." Thus each sister had her share of hardship. Meg's discontent, Jo's temper, Beth's shyness, Amy's vanity. Yet they bore them together, and their mother, wise and patient, guided them with steady hand. That evening, Mommy gathered her girls about her and spoke gently. "My darlings, we all have burdens to bear, but remember this, they are given us to shape our characters. We cannot choose our lot, but we can choose how we meet it. Riches do not bring happiness, nor does ease make us noble. If you learn to conquer yourselves, you will be greater than kings." Her words, spoken with quiet conviction, sank deep into their young hearts. And though the struggles did not vanish, the sisters took up their burdens with renewed courage, determined to be, in their own way, pilgrims pressing on towards the better city.
Chapter 5. Being Neighborly. Snow still lay thick upon the ground, though the holidays were fading into ordinary days again. The March sisters kept busy with lessons, chores, and small pleasures, but Jo, with her restless nature, found the routine irksome. Her friendship with Laurie had begun to blossom, and she longed for more adventure than her own parlor could provide. It was on one such afternoon, when the cold nipped at the windows and Meg was away, that Jo stood at her window gazing toward the great Lawrence house. From her vantage point, she could see into one of the upper rooms where Laurie often sat. Today, he was at the window himself, pale from his recent illness, leaning idly upon the sill as though longing for company. Jo's quick eyes brightened at once. "Poor boy looks as dull as a post," she muttered. "I should go over and cheer him, only it might be dreadfully improper." She drummed her fingers against the glass, thinking. Then her daring nature overcame her hesitation. "Oh, fiddlesticks! Why should I care what people think? He needs a friend, and I shall be that friend." Pulling on her hood and cloak, Jo clattered downstairs. "Where are you off to in such a hurry, miss?" Hannah called from the kitchen. "Just to be neighborly," Jo replied, and before anyone could stop her, she was out the door, her boots crunching through the snow. The Lawrence house loomed before her, stately and rather forbidding, but Jo marched boldly up the steps and rang the bell. A solemn servant admitted her, looking somewhat surprised at the sight of this tall, lively girl with wind-flushed cheeks. "I came to see Laurie," Jo explained without ceremony. "Tell him it's Jo March, if you please." Soon she was ushered into a warm, handsome room lined with books and hung with fine pictures. Laurie lay on a couch by the fire, wrapped in a shawl. At the sight of Jo, he sat up eagerly, his dark eyes shining. "How good of you to come," he explained. "I was just wishing for company. I saw you mooning out the window and thought you'd be glad of a chat," Jo said cheerily, throwing off her cloak. "I brought you some of Beth's blancmange. It's soft enough for invalids, and one of my books, if you care to be amused." Laurie laughed as she set her bundles down. "You are the very soul of kindness. Pray sit down, Miss Jo, and make yourself at home." Jo flung herself into a chair with her usual freedom. "Thank you, I will. You don't look very ill, only bored." "I'm both," Laurie confessed. "Grandfather won't let me stir out until I'm entirely well, so I'm trapped indoors with nothing to do." "Then I'll amuse you," Jo declared. "Tell me what you usually do when you're not sick." Thus began a lively talk. Laurie spoke of his life, how he had been raised abroad in France and Italy, where his mother had taken him until her death. Now he lived with his grandfather, Mr. Lawrence, a stern but kind-hearted man who wished to prepare him for college. "I've had tutors and masters, but very little company of my own age. It's dreadfully lonely here. You can't think how often I've longed to know you girls better, but I daren't intrude." Jo's eyes sparkled. "Why not? We're not fine ladies. We'd have welcomed you gladly." Laurie smiled, almost shyly. "I know that now. You're very good to come." Jo, with her frankness, replied, "I mean to come often,
and you must come to us. Beth will play you music, Meg will be proper and polite, Amy will entertain you with her airs, and well, I'll just be myself, which isn't saying much, but at least I shan't bore you." Laurie laughed heartily, and his pale face grew brighter than it had in weeks. As they talked, Joe's quick eyes roved about the handsome room, lingering on the well-stocked shelves. "Mercy, what a library you've got! I'd give anything to rummage in it." "You may whenever you like," Laurie said eagerly. "Grandfather will be pleased if someone makes use of it." Joe clasped her hands with delight. "Then I shall come and feast on books like a hungry dog on a bone. Oh, what happiness!" Her enthusiasm so amused Laurie that he nearly forgot he was supposed to be an invalid. They grew merrier with every moment, until at last a firm step was heard in the hall. Joe started, for the door opened, and in came old Mr. Lawrence himself, tall, white-haired, with piercing eyes, and an air of command that most people tremble. Laurie looked anxious, but Joe, with her usual boldness, rose and curtsied. "How do you do, sir? I'm Joe March, come to see your grandson." The old gentleman surveyed her keenly. Then, to Laurie's relief, his stern mouth softened into a smile. "Well, well, so this is the lively Miss Joe I've heard about. You are very welcome, young lady. I thank you for cheering up my boy." Joe beamed. "Oh, he's not half as dull as he looks. We've been having a capital time." Mr. Lawrence chuckled, patting her on the shoulder. "You're a brave lass. Come again, and bring your sisters. This house needs a bit of young life." When Joe went home that afternoon, she burst into the parlor with glowing cheeks. "I've had the most splendid time. Laurie's as nice as can be, and Mr. Lawrence, well, he looks like an old eagle, but he has a kind heart. And girls, listen, he said we may come whenever we like, and we can use the library." At this news, Beth clasped her hands with delight. Meg smiled in quiet pleasure, and Amy, always practical, said, "Then perhaps we shall become acquainted with better society." Joe only laughed. "Never mind society, we found a friend, and that's worth more than all the parties in the world."
Chapter 6. Beth finds the palace beautiful. Of all the March sisters, Beth was the shyest. While Joe longed for adventure, Meg dreamed of refinement, and Amy sought admiration. Beth desired nothing more than to remain quietly at home, tending her duties, caring for her dolls and kittens, and above all, playing her beloved piano. That piano was a humble old instrument, scarred and out of tune, yet to Beth it was a treasure. She coaxed from its keys soft, sweet melodies that filled the March parlor with gentle comfort. The others often declared that Beth's music was the heart of the home. Yet Beth herself longed secretly for a better instrument, though she never voiced the wish aloud. It happened one afternoon, not long after Joe's first visit to the Lawrences. Mr. Lawrence, the old gentleman with the eagle eye, had taken a liking to the March girls, largely because of Joe's frankness and Lowry's delight in their company. He had heard Beth's name mentioned often, but had yet to meet her, for she shrank away whenever he appeared. "Why doesn't that little one come to see me?" he asked Joe one day. "She's too shy, sir," Joe explained. "She hardly ever goes anywhere, but she loves music better than anything." Mr. Lawrence nodded thoughtfully. "So I've heard. Well, perhaps she'll come for that." The next day, when Jo returned home, she burst into the parlor with sparkling eyes. "Beth, Mr. Lawrence says you may come and play on his grand piano whenever you like. Isn't that splendid?" Beth's face turned pale at the thought. "Oh, Jo, I couldn't. He's so grand, and I'm so timid, I should die of fright." "Nonsense," said Jo. "He's not half as formidable as he looks, and Lowry will be there to keep you company." Beth clasped her hands tightly. "I couldn't, truly, I couldn't. But, oh, Jo, the piano! To touch such keys, to hear the music sing as it should." Her eyes shone with longing, though fear still held her back. For several days, Beth wavered, torn between desire and dread. At last, Jo lost patience. "Come along, Beth. I'll take you myself. If you faint, I'll carry you home again. But you must meet him." So, with trembling steps, Beth allowed Jo to lead her across the snowy garden to the Lawrence house. Her heart beat wildly as they entered the grand hall, and by the time they reached the music room, she was near tears. Mr. Lawrence was there, seated by the fire. At sight of the timid girl half hiding behind her sister, his stern face softened. He rose, and with unexpected gentleness took Beth's hand. "So this is the little music lover," he said kindly. "Come, my dear, don't be afraid. I've heard you play, and I should like you to make this piano sing again. It belonged to my little granddaughter, Lowry's mother. It has stood silent too long." Beth's eyes widened. "Your granddaughter?" she whispered. "Yes," he said, his voice grave but tender. "She was about your age when she used to sit here, her fingers dancing over the keys. You remind me of her. I'd be honored if you would play." At those words, Beth's fear melted into sympathy. She slipped from Jo's side, sat at the piano, and touched the keys. At first her hands trembled, but soon the notes flowed clear and true, filling the room with music so sweet that even the old man's stern eyes grew misty. When the piece ended, Beth rose shyly, as if to slip away, but the old man laid a hand upon her shoulder. "Thank you, my dear. You must come often, for this instrument was made to be played, not to stand in silence." Beth looked up at him, and with sudden courage kissed his wrinkled cheek. "I will come," she whispered. The old gentleman started, unused to such affection, then his stern face broke into a smile. "Bless the child," he murmured, patting her hand. From that day a new friendship blossomed. Beth overcame her shyness little by little, creeping daily to the Lawrence house, where she played to her heart's content. In return, Mr. Lawrence treated her with grandfatherly kindness, giving her flowers from his conservatory, books of music, and gentle words that warmed her timid spirit. The March family, watching, declared that Beth had found the palace beautiful, and indeed it was so. For within those grand rooms she discovered not only the joy of music, but the treasure of a new tender bond with the old man who had once seemed so formidable.
Chapter 7. Amy's Valley of Humiliation. If Beth's trials came from timidity, then Amy's came from pride. She was the youngest of the March girls, vain of her pretty curls, eager for admiration, and fond of elegance in all things. Yet she was also affectionate, earnest, and, though she did not always see it herself, prone to learning lessons in the hardest way. It was on a brisk winter morning that Amy appeared at the breakfast table with an air of great importance.
In her hand she held a small, much-worn green notebook, tied with a faded ribbon. "What have you there, little one?" asked Meg, pouring the tea. Amy smoothed the ribbon with pride. "It is my contribution to our literary society. Since Joe and Meg will not allow me to join the Pickwick Club, I have written a story of my own, and I intend to read it aloud at school. Girls of my age need encouragement, you know." Joe burst out laughing. "A story indeed! I suppose it will be about castles, knights, and elegant ladies with impossible hair." Amy tossed her golden head. "Better castles and ladies than slang and scandal. At least my writing will be proper." Beth, always peacemaker, whispered softly, "I think it's nice, Amy. Will you read it to us later?" Amy blushed with satisfaction, while Joe rolled her eyes. "You'll never learn if you can't laugh at yourself. But mind, don't get into trouble at school for playing authoress." Amy attended the local school, taught by stern Mr. Davis, a man more given to rules than kindness. Amy, who loved fine manners and delicate society, had long considered his classroom a trial. Still she managed to endure until one fateful day. That morning she tucked her little notebook into her satchel with the air of an aspiring genius. At recess, she read her tale aloud to two admiring friends, who giggled over the grand words and tragic scenes. Unfortunately, the sound carried farther than she expected, and Mr. Davis, with his hawk's ear, swooped down upon her. "What is this nonsense?" he demanded, snatching the notebook from her hands. It is only my own writing, sir," Amy stammered, cheeks scarlet. He turned the pages, frowning deeply. "Romantic drivel, idle scribblings. Is this what you bring into my classroom, instead of attending to your sums and recitations?" Amy could not answer. Her pride and her terror choked her voice. "You will stand upon the platform," declared Mr. Davis, "so that all may see the folly of such vanity." The punishment was cruel to a child so sensitive. Before the entire class, Amy was placed upon the platform, her cheeks burning, her eyes brimming with tears, and Mr. Davis scolded her as an example. The little notebook, once so precious, was tossed contemptuously aside. To Amy, it was as if her very soul had been torn open before her companions. The giggles of the girls, the whispers of the boys, and the cold severity of her master cut her to the heart. By the time school was dismissed, she was trembling from head to foot. Humiliation seared into her memory. That afternoon she trudged home through the snow, clutching her books to her chest. At the sight of Joe by the fire, she burst into tears. "What on earth's the matter now?" cried Joe, startled. With sobs, Amy told the tale of her disgrace. Joe's eyes flashed. "The brute! To treat a little girl so harshly! I'd like to shake him." Meg, though gentler, was equally indignant. "It was cruel of him. Poor Amy, you shall not go back there again." Mrs. March, hearing the story, took her youngest daughter tenderly into her arms. "You have been very wronged, my dear, but let us not repay harshness with bitterness. We must remember that pride can lead us into snares, and that humility, though hard to bear, brings wisdom." "But, Mommy," sobbed Amy, "everyone laughed at me. I shall never hold up my head again." "Then you must hold it the higher," said her mother softly. "Do your duty bravely, and let the laughter of others make you stronger, not weaker."
True to her word, Mrs. March withdrew Amy from Mr. Davis's school, deciding she should be taught at home until a gentler teacher could be found. Amy was comforted, though her heart still smarted from the sting of ridicule. For many days afterward she walked carefully, as though each step were taken in the shadow of her disgrace. Yet the sisters, with kindness and laughter, soon coaxed her back to cheerfulness. Jo teased her into smiles, Beth played soft tunes to soothe her, and Meg showed her how to turn her humiliation into resolve. Thus, Amy's valley of humiliation became the first of many steep paths she must travel, learning that pride, once humbled, may yet bloom into strength and grace.
Chapter 8. Jo meets Apollyon. The March house was rarely without its quarrels, for four young tempers cannot always run smoothly together. Yet never before had such a storm arisen as the one that followed Amy's humiliation. Jo, with her quick tongue and hot heart, prided herself on loyalty, but she also bore grudges with a ferocity that frightened her gentler sisters. Amy, still smarting from her punishment at school, longed to be included in Jo's doings, and it was from this small longing that the quarrel grew into something perilous. The quarrel begins. One crisp afternoon, Jo and Laurie had planned to go skating on the frozen river. Jo came downstairs, muffled in her red scarf, skates dangling over her arm, when Amy called after her. "Jo, may I come too?" she asked, breathless with eagerness. Jo frowned. "No, you'll only be in the way. You can't keep up with us and I don't want to bother." "But I can skate very well now," pleaded Amy. "Please, I'll be so quiet you won't even know I'm there." Jo turned sharply. "I said no. You're a nuisance when you tag along. Don't be a baby about it." Amy's face flushed, but Jo, with her usual impetuosity, dashed out the door before another word could be said. Amy stood a moment, her fists clenched, her heart swelling with both hurt and anger. Then her eyes fell upon the drawer where Jo kept her most treasured possession, a thick manuscript, the fruit of many months of labor, filled with Jo's wild stories of heroes and battles, written in her bold, sprawling hand. A dreadful thought, born of childish revenge, entered Amy's mind. "She never thinks of me, never includes me," Amy whispered, trembling with passion. "Perhaps if her book were gone, she'd feel what I feel now." While the others were upstairs, Amy crept to the drawer, pulled out the fat sheaf of pages, and held it in her small hands. At first, her heart quailed, for even in anger she knew what it meant to Jo. But pride, stung by Jo's scorn, hardened her. She fed the manuscript into the fire. The flames caught eagerly, curling the pages, licking the ink into blackened ruin. Amy watched, half thrilled, half terrified, until the last sheet had turned to ashes. Jo's fury. That evening, Jo came home, cheeks glowing from the frosty air, her eyes bright from skating. She ran upstairs to her room, eager to add a new scene to her beloved story. But when she opened the drawer, it was empty. At first, she thought she had misplaced it. She searched under pillows, behind books, beneath the bed. Then she flew downstairs, wild with fear. "Has anyone touched my papers?" she demanded. The silence in the parlor was broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Amy, pale but defiant, whispered, "I burned them." For a moment, Jo did not comprehend. Then the truth struck her like a blow.
You burned them, she gasped. All my work, every story, every line. Amy quivered, but held her ground. Yes, and I'd do it again. You are cruel to me, Joe. You never let me join you. Now you know how it feels to lose what you care for. A flame leapt in Joe's eyes, more terrible than the one that had consumed her book. She strode forward, her hand raised as if to strike. Meg caught her arm in horror. "Joe, no!" cried Meg. But Joe tore herself free, trembling with rage. Her voice shook with a bitterness none had ever heard from her before. "I'll never forgive you, Amy, never while I live." The ice breaks. The next day, Jo avoided her sister with cold contempt. Amy, repentant and frightened now by the consequences of her deed, tried again and again to win Jo's forgiveness, but Jo turned away in silence. When Laurie came to take Jo skating once more, Amy followed them to the river, hoping still to make peace. Jo, seeing her trudge behind, whispered fiercely to Laurie, "Don't help her. Let her keep away from me." Laurie, uncertain, obeyed. Amy, proud but determined, strapped on her skates by herself and followed at a distance. The ice was smooth and shining, but dangerous near the middle, where the current ran strong. Jo and Laurie skimmed over the frozen surface like swallows, laughing, while Amy struggled to keep up. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack. Amy cried out. A sheet of ice gave way, and she plunged into the freezing water. "Jo! Jo, help me!" The sound struck Jo's heart like a dagger. In an instant, her rage vanished, replaced by terror. She and Laurie sped back, flinging themselves flat upon the ice, reaching out desperately. Laurie grasped Amy's arms, while Jo clutched at her shoulders. Together they dragged her, shivering and half senseless, onto firm ground. Forgiveness. They hurried her home, where blankets and hot drinks soon revived her. Mrs. March, pale with fear, gave thanks for her daughter's safety, then turned to Jo with a look of grave tenderness. "My dear, see what anger can do. If you had not followed your sister, she might have perished. Will you let pride and resentment part you from her again?" Jo burst into tears. "Oh, Mommy, it was wicked of me. I was so angry I wished never to speak to her again. And if she had died, I could never have forgiven myself." She crept to Amy's bedside, where her sister lay weak but smiling faintly. Jo took her hand and pressed it against her cheek. "Forgive me, Amy. I was cruel and selfish. I'll try to be better, if you'll only love me still." Amy's blue eyes filled with tears. "I'm the one who needs forgiveness. I was wicked to burn your book. I'll never do such a thing again." And so, with sobs and kisses, the quarrel ended. Jo had met her Apollyon, her own fierce temper, and though she had not wildly conquered it, she had learned how near destruction such anger could lead her.
Chapter 9. Meg Goes to Vanity Fair. The March girls had lived so long within the circle of their modest home that the grandeur of wealth was to them like a fairyland seen only from afar. It was Meg, the eldest, who most often sighed for finer things, pretty gowns, soft gloves, and elegant society. Though she loved her family dearly, she was sometimes discontented with her plain life, especially when comparing it to the luxuries of her wealthy friends. So it was that when Annie Moffat invited her to spend a week at her grand house, Meg's heart fluttered with excitement. The invitation. "I don't see why I shouldn't go," Meg said one evening as they sat sewing by the fire. Her cheeks glowed at the very thought.
It will be such a treat. Dances, fine clothes, handsome people. Annie has been so kind to invite me." Joe gave a snort. "I think it's nonsense. You'll only come back cross and discontented, and you'll have to dress like a doll to please them." "Joe," cried Meg, "I want to see a little of the world. Surely there is no harm in that." Marmee laid down her work and looked at Meg with her quiet, wise eyes. "Go, my dear, if you wish, but remember, it is better to be loved for being simple and good than admired for fine feathers." Meg promised, though her heart still leapt at the vision of the week ahead. The Moffats' house. The Moffats lived in a great mansion, with polished floors, chandeliers dripping with crystal, and servants who moved about like shadows. Meg felt awkward at first in her simple frock, but Annie and her mother welcomed her warmly, praising her beauty and making much of her. "Don't be shy, Meg," whispered Annie, as they entered the drawing-room, where a dozen young ladies and gentlemen laughed and chatted. "You are prettier than half of them already. Wait until you're dressed properly. You'll turn heads, I promise." Meg blushed, half pleased, half ashamed. Though she loved her family dearly, she was sometimes discontented with her plain life, especially when comparing it to the luxuries of her wealthy friends. So it was that when Annie Moffat invited her to spend a week at her grand house, Meg's heart fluttered with excitement. The temptation. On the evening of the great dance, Mrs. Moffat and her daughters devised a plan. "Meg, you are far too modest in your gown," said one. "We must make you look splendid tonight." Before Meg could protest, they brought out silken dresses, laces, and ribbons. They curled her hair until it fell in shining ringlets, dusted her cheeks with powder, and tied a string of pearls around her neck. At last, they fastened her into a low-cut gown of pale pink silk, quite unlike anything she had ever worn. When Meg looked into the mirror, she hardly knew herself. A lovely, fashionable young lady gazed back at her. She smiled, intoxicated by the sight. "Oh, you are a beauty," cried Annie. "Now Laurie will lose his heart to you for certain." At the mention of Laurie's name, Meg's heart gave a startled leap. "Don't say such things," she murmured. But Annie only laughed and whispered with her friends, and Meg, flattered, yet uneasy, descended to the ballroom in a cloud of perfume and satin. The ball. The music played, the chandeliers glittered, and the room swilled with gowns and laughter. Meg was courted and complimented, her hands sought for dances again and again. She smiled and curtsied, thrilled by the attention. Yet now and then she caught her reflection in a mirror and wondered uneasily whether it was truly herself she saw, or only a doll dressed in borrowed finery. In a quiet moment she overheard two gentlemen speaking. "Pretty little creature?" "Yes," replied the other, with a sly smile. "But she is only a poor March. They say she is trying to ensnare young Lawrence." Meg's cheeks burned. She turned away, her joy pierced by shame. Was this what fine society meant? Flattery with one breath, scorn with the next? Laurie's eyes. Later that night, Laurie appeared at the ball. His eyes widened when he saw Meg in her pink silk gown, so unlike the modest sister he knew. "Why, Meg, you don't look like yourself at all," he exclaimed. Meg tossed her head, half vexed, half embarrassed. "I suppose I must look respectable in such company." But Laurie only frowned. "I like you better in your simple dress, with your hair as you always wear it. You're much more you." His words, spoken so earnestly, struck deeper than all the compliments of the evening.
The lesson. The week passed in a whirl of feasts, visits, and gossip. At first, Meg delighted in it all, but little by little she grew weary. The fine gowns pinched, the late nights left her pale, and the endless talk of fashion and fortune seemed empty compared to the warmth of her home. When she returned at last to Orchard House, she dropped her borrowed finery with a sigh of relief and ran straight into Marmy's arms. "Oh, Marmy, I've had such a foolish week. I was dressed up and flattered, but it was all hollow. I see now that it is far better to be content with our own ways. I don't want to be a doll again." Mrs. March kissed her daughter tenderly. "I am glad you have learned that lesson, my dear. Riches and finery may dazzle for a moment, but character and simplicity shine far longer." And Meg, humbled and wiser, sat down by the fire in her plain dress, happy to be herself once more.
Chapter 10. The PC and PO, Pickwick Club and Post Office. The March parlour was alive with giggles and whispered secrets one blustery afternoon, for the sisters were engaged in one of their most beloved amusements. Inspired by Dickens and their own lively imaginations, they had founded a society of wit, learning, and nonsense, grandly entitled the Pickwick Club. Jo, of course, was the driving spirit of the scheme. With her love for quills, inky fingers, and bold speeches, she appointed herself editor and president under the name of Mr. Snodgrass. Meg, more decorous and gentle, became Mr. Pickwick, the dignified head of the club. Beth, shy but always willing, agreed to be Mr. Tupman, and Amy, delighted to adopt a grand air, claimed the role of Mr. Winkle. They even produced a handwritten journal, the Pickwick Portfolio, filled with poems, essays, riddles, and gossip columns, all carefully stitched together by Jo and read aloud at each weekly meeting. The club in session. "Order, gentlemen," declared Jo one evening, pounding the table with a ruler. She had stuffed her long legs into a pair of old boots, donned a smoking cap of scarlet cloth, and spoke in as deep a voice as she could muster. Meg, seated with stately grace and wearing father's spectacles, nodded gravely. "The meeting of the Pickwick Club is now called to order. Mr. Snodgrass, will you read the minutes?" Jo cleared her throat, opened a notebook, and began in mock-serious tones. "The last meeting of the PC was held at the residence of Mr. Pickwick, where great hilarity prevailed. Mr. Winkle fell into a disgraceful passion upon being contradicted in the discussion of whether cats or dogs are more faithful, and was with difficulty restrained from using personal violence. Mr. Tupman was requested to sing a ballad, which he did after much blushes and stammerings to the satisfaction of all present. Mr. Snodgrass read a stirring essay on the character of Julius Caesar, pronounced by the members to be admirable nonsense. The meeting adjourned with 3 cheers for the society and the editor. The girls burst out laughing, Amy crying, "I did not lose my temper. Jo writes those things just to tease me." "Silence, gentlemen," said Meg, with dignity, though her eyes sparkled. "Proceed with the new business." The portfolio. Jo handed around the Pickwick portfolio, written in her bold scrawl and decorated with comic sketches. Each sister had contributed. Meg had written a moral tale about vanity. Jo offered a blood-curdling adventure full of sword fights and mystery. Beth supplied a little song and a touching story about a family of kittens. Amy produced elegant sketches with long captions sprinkled liberally with French phrases.
The reading was punctuated with laughter, applause, and much teasing until Meg announced, "Gentlemen, we have an important matter to consider. A new candidate wishes to join our club." The sisters looked at each other knowingly, for all had guessed who the candidate might be. Jo flushed with excitement. "It is young Mr. Lawrence. He has expressed a great desire to join us and promises to submit proper contributions to the portfolio. What say you, gentlemen?" Beth clapped her hands softly. "Oh, yes, let him in. He is so fond of reading, and he will be no trouble." Meg hesitated. "But it is supposed to be our club." Amy, with her usual air of elegance, remarked, "It might be rather distinguished to have a gentleman of society among us." Jo could contain herself no longer. "He's such a good fellow, always ready for fun, and he'll bring fresh ideas. I say we admit him." After much mock debate, they voted and Laurie was unanimously accepted as an honorary member of the Pickwick Club. The post office. The addition of Laurie inspired another ingenious idea. For convenience and secrecy, they established a post office in a small wooden box set up at the side gate between the March house and the Lawrence mansion. Into this little box they dropped letters, invitations, drawings, and tiny gifts to be fetched each day with great ceremony. Laurie delighted in the game. He scribbled witty notes, left candies for Amy, music sheets for Beth, clever riddles for Jo, and polite compliments for Meg. The March girls, in turn, sent him their essays, sketches, and mock official documents, all signed with their club names. The tiny post office soon became the heart of their friendship. More than just a box, it was a bridge between two houses, uniting the lonely boy next door with the lively sisters who treated him as one of their own. A brotherhood. At the next meeting, Laurie appeared in full force, wearing an old wig he had borrowed from the theatre and bowing extravagantly as he announced himself, "Mr. Sam Weller, at your service." The girls shrieked with laughter and welcomed him warmly. Soon he was seated among them, reading from the portfolio with gusto, teasing Amy, applauding Beth's stories, and exchanging sly winks with Jo over the absurdities of their invented rules. For all their nonsense, there was real affection in the little club. Each member contributed their talents, Meg's good sense, Jo's fiery imagination, Beth's sweetness, Amy's artistic flair, and Laurie's high spirits. In that circle of merriment, they forgot their burdens, and the world seemed a brighter, kinder place. Thus the Pickwick Club, with its dignified name and foolish doings, flourished to the delight of its members. And though their writings were crude and their rules absurd, the laughter they shared was genuine, and the bonds they wove that winter grew strong enough to last a lifetime.
Chapter 14. Secrets. The March household had grown quieter now that the sparkle of summer had passed. The long sunlit afternoons of games and castles in the air gave way to the cooler stirrings of autumn. Yet, within the little brown house, there was a brightness all its own, for the girls' lives were threaded with new undertakings and unspoken dreams. Jo, in particular, seemed filled with restless energy. She disappeared for hours at a time, clutching her shabby portfolio beneath her arm, and returned flushed and mysterious, as though she had wrestled with some dragon or scaled a private mountain. At table, she would sometimes forget her bread, lost in thought. At night she scribbled furiously by candlelight, her pen scratching like a small animal scurrying in its burrow. Meg noticed first. "Jo, where do you go day after day when Mother sends you out with that solemn face of yours? I hope you are not running into mischief." "I should like to know what you mean by mischief," Joe retorted, too quickly. "I'm attending to my business, if you must know." "What business?" Meg pressed gently, amused by her sister's secrecy. "My own," said Joe, with an air of finality that only sharpened curiosity. Joe's secret venture. The truth was this: Joe had taken her stories, those wild, extravagant tales she had written by the fire and winter nights, and carried them into the city. Heart-pounding, she had submitted them to a magazine editor, half ashamed, half desperate with hope. To her amazement, one had been accepted. A small sum of money had been pressed into her hands, crisp and real, and Joe had walked home in a daze, clutching her first earned wages as though it were treasure plundered from a giant. Never had she felt so independent, so proud, so fiercely herself, yet she told no one. Perhaps she feared they would laugh at her wild plots and dramatic heroines. Perhaps she wished to keep the triumph all her own until she had proven it was no mere accident. So she hid the money in an old tin box beneath her bed, along with her scribbled drafts. The box grew heavier, not with coin, though there were a few more of those added secretly, but with dreams that only she knew. Laurie grew curious. Laurie, meanwhile, had not failed to observe her comings and goings. From his window across the way he saw her set forth in the morning, striding like a soldier on a mission. Sometimes she did not return until dusk, her eyes bright and lips pressed with satisfaction. One afternoon, as Joe slipped out with her portfolio, Laurie followed at a distance, amused by the idea of playing spy. Through winding streets and busy markets she went, at last entering a tall building where the name of a publisher was painted upon the door. Laurie's eyes widened. So that was her secret. He waited until she reappeared, looking triumphant, then hurried home before she could discover his trick. The teasing. That evening, as the March family sat together by the fire, Laurie dropped in as usual. He lingered by Joe's chair with an air of mischief. "So, Miss March, how is business?" he said in mock solemnity. Joe started, nearly overturning her ink bottle. "Business? What do you mean by that?" Laurie twinkled at her. "Oh, nothing, only that I saw you marching off to the publisher's office this afternoon. Very grand, very mysterious." Joe's cheeks flamed. "You had no right to follow me," she cried. "I did not follow," Laurie said innocently. "I merely walked in the same direction, and imagine my surprise when I found you emerging with such a satisfied expression, like a cat with cream." Meg looked up, startled. "Joe, have you been selling your stories?" Beth clapped her hands softly. "Oh, Joe, really?" Joe groaned, burying her face in her hands. "There, the cat is out of the bag, thanks to this odious boy. Yes, I have, and what is more, I've earned money for it." She pulled the tin box from beneath her chair and shook out a few coins, which jingled merrily upon the table. The others stared as though she had produced gold from straw. Reactions. "Why, Joe, how splendid!" Meg exclaimed. "You should have told us sooner. Think of father. How proud he will be." Beth's eyes shone with tender pride. "I knew you could do it, Joe. You've always had such wonderful stories." Amy pursed her lips. "Well, I do hope they were not improper. Some magazines are filled with dreadful nonsense." Joe laughed. Improper? Not a bit. My heroines may faint a little too often, and my villains growl too loudly, but they are as proper as you please, and the editor paid me, which proves they are good enough for the world at least." Laurie leaned closer. "Bravo, Joe! You've struck a vein. But tell me, what will you do with your earnings? Buy ink and paper, or treat us all to ice cream?" Joe's eyes danced. "Neither. I'm saving every penny for a purpose. One day I shall go to Europe. Mark my words. I'll study, write, and live among the great minds, and all because of these humble stories." The others laughed, but Joe spoke with such passion that they could not doubt her. Later that night, after Laurie had gone and the house grew quiet, Joe sat by the window, her manuscript open upon her lap. The moon shone silver upon the page, and her heart swelled with a curious mixture of pride and dread. It was no longer a secret. Her family knew, Laurie knew. The hidden box was not hers alone to guard, yet instead of feeling diminished, she felt lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. For now her dream was not locked away, but shared with those who loved her best. She closed the manuscript with a firm hand. "I will work harder than ever," she whispered. "I will build my castle with ink and paper, and nothing shall tear it down." And in the quiet of the little brown house, Joe March began to taste the first true sweetness of ambition fulfilled.
Chapter 15. A Telegram. The November wind rattled the bare branches against the windows of the little brown house. Inside, the March girls were gathered in the parlor, each busy with her own task. Meg hemmed a fine handkerchief, her brows smooth with patient care. Jo bent over her desk, the scratch of her pen filling the silence. Beth mended one of Hannah's aprons with neat, small stitches. Amy sat at the table sketching a fashion plate, her pencil shading folds of silk that she dreamed of one day wearing. It was a peaceful afternoon, full of small sounds and quiet industry, yet beneath that calm surface, each girl nursed her own secret hopes and plans. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the stillness. Hannah came in, her face pale and serious, a thin envelope trembling in her flour-stained hands. "Miss March," she said hoarsely, "a telegram has come." The room stilled at once. Jo dropped her pen, Amy's pencil rolled across the table, Beth's needle froze in mid-air. Meg rose quickly and took the envelope, her hands trembling as she tore it open. They gathered around, breath held. Meg read aloud in a voice that wavered, yet strove for steadiness. "Washington, D.C., your husband very ill. Come at once. Mr. March's friend and chaplain." The shock. For a moment, silence reigned. The words hung heavy, as though the very air had thickened around them. Meg turned pale and sank into a chair. Jo uttered a sharp cry, her hands clenching as if to strike the invisible foe that threatened her father. Beth's eyes brimmed at once with tears, while Amy whispered, "Oh, Mother," and covered her face. Hannah, sturdy soul that she was, dashed her apron across her eyes, muttering, "Poor dear man, and poor Miss Marmee to bear such a load." Almost at once the front door opened, and Marmee herself entered. She had been to the Hummels, carrying broth for the sick baby, and she looked weary, her bonnet strings loosened, her cloak spotted by the mist. One glance at her daughters' faces told her that something grave had happened. "What is it, my children?" she asked, her voice calm, though her eyes searched theirs with sudden fear.
Meg placed the telegram in her hand. "It is from Father's friend. He is very ill, and they want you to come." Mrs. March read it silently, pressing her lips together. Then, folding the paper carefully, she said in her steady, tender way, "I must go at once. Hannah, help me prepare what I shall need. Girls, do not be frightened. God will take care of us." At once the house, so still a moment before, filled with bustle. Trunks were fetched from the attic, Hannah shook out garments, Meg laid aside her sewing to fold linen with trembling fingers. Joe rushed to the cupboard for ink and paper, declaring she would write to Mr. Lawrence at once to ask for help with arrangements. Beth followed her mother about like a shadow, her small hands eager to be useful, though her tears fell fast. Amy, white and solemn, brought Marmee her traveling bag, which she had polished earlier that day in girlish play, never imagining it would be used for so grave a purpose. In the midst of the commotion, Laurie appeared, breathless. He had seen the messenger from the telegraph office and hurried across the garden. "What is it? I feared bad news," he cried. Joe thrust the telegram into his hands, too shaken for words. He read, whistled low, and without a moment's pause said, "I shall go to Grandfather. He will see that your mother is on the next train south and that nothing is lacking." Before they could thank him, he was gone, fleet as a boy on an errand of mercy. Marmee's calm strength. Through it all, Marmee moved with quiet strength. She comforted Meg when her hands faltered, soothed Beth when she clung to her skirts, and even managed to smile faintly at Amy, who offered her best handkerchief embroidered with a crooked A in one corner. "My little girls," she said gently, "this is the hour to be brave. We have borne trials before, and we shall bear this one together. Your father would wish to see you cheerful and dutiful, not overcome with fear." Then drawing Joe aside, she spoke low. "Dearest, I leave the care of the house to you. You have energy enough for all. Help Hannah, comfort your sisters, and remember that though I am far away, my heart is always here." Joe's eyes filled, yet she set her jaw. "Yes, Mother, I'll do my best. I'd go with you if I could, but since I cannot, I'll take care of everything here. You needn't fear." Marmee kissed her tenderly. "That is what I counted on, my Joe." A friend's generosity. True to his word, Laurie returned with Mr. Lawrence's carriage, and behind him came the old gentleman himself, grave and kind. He pressed Mrs. March's hand warmly. "My dear madam, you shall be at the station tonight, and under no care for money or arrangements. Allow me this small service to my friend's wife." Marmee's gratitude shone in her eyes, though she could hardly speak. Meg curtsied, Beth whispered, "Thank you," and Amy, in her impulsive way, caught the old man's hand and pressed it to her cheek. He patted her shoulder gruffly, muttering something about a set of brave little girls. Nightfall. By lamplight the preparations were complete. Marmee sat with her daughters one last time before her departure. She read to them a psalm of comfort, her voice steady, though her hand trembled slightly as it rested on the open Bible. Then she kissed each one in turn, Meg, tearful but resolute, Joe, fierce and clinging, Beth, trembling yet gentle, Amy, solemn and trying hard not to cry. "My little girls," she said, whispering, "be good while I am gone, help one another, and remember, my darlings, that to love and trust is better than to fear." Soon after, the carriage wheels rattled away into the night, carrying Marmee toward the great city and the sick room where Mr. March lay. The girls watched from the window until the lights vanished. For the first time, the little brown house felt strangely empty.
Chapter 16 Letters. The little brown house had grown quiet after Marmee's departure. The rooms, so often filled with chatter, laughter, and the clatter of domestic activity, seemed subdued. Yet life did not stand still. The March girls, though anxious for news of their father and mother, set themselves to tasks both practical and comforting. Jo seized the responsibility of the household with fiery determination. She tended the fire, wrote notes to friends, and ensured that Hannah's work proceeded smoothly. Meg oversaw the meals and kept the younger sisters in order. Beth, gentle and quiet, spent her time at the piano, filling the house with soft, soothing music, while Amy, with careful hands, polished silver and arranged flowers, trying to brighten the rooms as best she could. Yet amid all these labors, each of the sisters felt the silent ache of separation. They longed to hear from Marmee, to know that father was resting and that she was safe. The first letters. One chilly morning, as frost edged the windows, a letter arrived by post. Jo tore it open eagerly. The handwriting was familiar, strong and deliberate, though hurried. It was Marmee. My dear children, I am safely arrived, and your father is better than when I last wrote. The journey was tiresome, but necessary. I am so proud of your courage and care at home. Do not be anxious. God watches over us all. Give my love to Hannah and help one another as you always do. I shall write again soon. Ever your loving mother. Jo read the words aloud, her voice trembling with relief. Meg wiped her eyes. Beth leaned forward, smiling through her tears. Even Amy, who tried to look aloof, pressed her hand to her mouth, catching back a sob. "It's as though she were here," Jo whispered. "Yes," said Meg softly. "And yet we must be strong, for she trusts us to keep the house together. And to care for each other," Beth added, her fingers brushing her piano keys absent-mindedly. Writing to father. The girls did not stop at reading Marmee's letters. Each in turn took pen in hand to write to their father in Washington. Jo, fiery and earnest, recounted the small adventures of the household, the antics of the kittens, and her own literary endeavors. Meg wrote with propriety, describing their sewing and household management with precise care. Beth offered gentle, tender lines, full of love and music, while Amy, in her elegant, sometimes lofty fashion, detailed the sketches she had drawn, the flowers she tended, and her ambition to learn refinement and art. "Dear Father," Jo wrote, "I hope this letter finds you in better spirits. We are all well, though we miss you and Mother sorely. I have begun a new story, which I hope to finish before your return." Meg's careful hand added, "We are managing the household, and Hannah has been a perfect help. We hope you feel comforted to know us diligent and obedient." Beth's soft script ran, "I play the piano every day, hoping to keep our home filled with gentle music for you, and to send our love to Mother in every note." Amy's flourish completed the letters. "I try to be useful, and I long to see you and Mother again. I hope my drawings will bring some delight to you when you read this." After sealing their letters, the girls sat together by the fire, each lost in thought.
The room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the occasional sigh. Yet the silence was not oppressive. It was filled with love, courage, and the small, steady hope that the letters would bring comfort to those far away. Joe broke the quiet at last. "We may be apart, but our words are like little bridges. Father and Mother will feel us near." Meg nodded. "And we shall know all is well because we have done our part." Beth pressed her hand to her heart. "It feels as though we have each held Mother's hand for her while she tends Father." Amy, usually so concerned with appearances, simply smiled. "And perhaps when they read our letters, they will see that we are growing, not just in years, but in heart." And so, through ink and paper, through careful thoughts and shared affection, the March girls learned the power of letters, the power to comfort, to connect, and to sustain the spirit through trials, distance, and uncertainty.
Chapter 17. Little Faithful. The little brown house seemed unusually quiet now that Marmee was away. The hearth glowed warmly, the fire crackled, and the rooms smelled faintly of simmering broth, polished wood, and the last faint traces of autumn flowers. Yet the absence of their mother, who had gone to Washington to care for their father, cast a subtle shadow. The March girls rose each morning with a sense of duty stronger than ever. Jo scurried about with brisk steps, her dark hair loose and her eyes bright, taking charge of household affairs with fiery determination. Meg managed the meals, planning each with care, and supervised Hannah's work to ensure that every dish, towel, and stitch met her mother's exacting standards. Amy polished the windows, dusted the shelves, and tended the little flower pots, anxious to bring color and cheer to the rooms. But above all, it was Beth who quietly held the home together. She was the center of stillness, a gentle heart that soothed the bustling energy around her. Beth's quiet strength. Each morning, Beth would awaken earlier than the others, slipping into the kitchen to make a little fire, draw water, and prepare small comforts for the household. She cleaned and polished silently, humming softly under her breath, her music weaving through the rooms like a gentle charm. Though she spoke little, her presence was felt in every corner. The girls looked at her and were reassured. Jo, who might have been anxious or impatient, found herself checking her work to avoid troubling Beth. Meg, who fretted over every small detail, relaxed under Beth's calm glance. Amy, often focused on beauty and perfection, found that Beth's simple care had its own elegance. "How quietly she works," Jo whispered one morning. "She never complains and never tires. It is as though she has a little fairy inside her that keeps everything in order." "And keeps us from fretting," Meg added softly. Beth merely smiled, a blush rising in her cheeks, and went on with her music, her knitting, her little household tasks, content that all was well. Trials and patience. Even as the girls tried to keep the home cheerful, small mishaps occurred. A kettle boiled over, a window pane became streaked with rain, a batch of bread refused to rise. Amy fretted over these things, and Jo cursed under her breath, tossing dishes aside in irritation. Meg tried to smooth tempers, yet sometimes snapped at the girls in weariness. Through it all, Beth remained calm. She washed the spilled water with care, dried the streaked panes, and sliced the uneven bread with gentle hands. When the others became irritable, she offered soft words of comfort. "Do not be troubled, Jo," she said quietly. "The fire is safe and the bread will nourish us still." "Oh, Beth," Amy cried one afternoon, "how you manage to be patient when we all are so careless." Beth's simple smile sufficed.
She did not argue or boast. She simply performed each small act of kindness as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Keeping faith. Each day brought news from Marmee through letters, which were read aloud by Meg in the evenings. Beth's eyes brightened at every word. She hummed at the piano the tunes that she had learned for Father, thinking of him far away, and she practiced patience as a duty in itself, knowing that comfort often lay in steadfastness rather than action. Joe often looked at her and felt a pang of admiration and guilt. "Beth is too good for us," she muttered one evening. "I don't know how she keeps so cheerful while we fuss over trifles." "She has little faith," Meg said with a smile, "but she trusts in God and Mother, and that is why she bears everything with a gentle heart." Beth simply nodded and resumed her gentle work, bending over the piano as though each note could carry love and reassurance across miles. A subtle influence. Though quiet, Beth's influence was profound. Joe learned to moderate her temper. Meg grew less anxious over trifles. Amy's vanity softened into consideration. Even Hannah, with her brusque manner, found herself inspired by the girls' unobtrusive diligence. The little house was kept orderly, meals regular, and spirits, though anxious, were sustained by the steady presence of one small, faithful heart. "She is our little angel," Jo whispered to herself one morning, watching Beth carry a tray of tea to Meg. Beth's secret strength lay not in grand deeds, but in the consistency of small acts. She became, in a sense, the silent guardian of the household's happiness, a reminder that even in the absence of those we love, we can uphold order, hope, and love with quiet patience. Evening reflection. As night fell, the four sisters gathered by the fire, reading Marmee's letters once more. Beth sat with her knitting, her eyes soft and shining, while Jo leaned on the arm of the sofa. Meg sat with her work in her lap, and Amy arranged the flowers that Beth had tended. "We shall be brave and keep our hearts gentle," Jo said. "And patient, like Beth," Meg added. "And faithful," whispered Amy. "Always faithful," Beth said softly, her voice like a gentle bell. "For those we love are never truly far when we remember them with care." In that quiet, tender evening, the March sisters learned the value of steadfastness and the hidden strength that resides in a gentle, faithful heart.